Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Good morning, Mike.
Hi, Jay. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good.
I am also doing good, though I wanted to let everyone know before we get to the show, I am in the midst of, well, not the midst, but I guess the very beginning of what I hope to be a big project. I am writing a book and
another one.
Yeah, well, another one. Yeah. And actually in this one, I'm hoping that listeners can help me out. In fact, I'm pretty sure that they can. The book's going to be all about the ways in which, actions of government or things that government doesn't do makes your life worse. I'm focusing on not like the big things like I couldn't get health care and so I had to get had to self-amputate my arm or whatever, huge, awful things that, everyone knows about. I'm thinking more about smaller, maybe less obvious things. Like, for instance, just a few days ago, I bought a new pair of tennis shoes, and most people might not know this, but we have huge and have had for a long time, huge tariffs on tennis shoes, particularly on, tennis shoes and other clothing items. And so that made that pair of tennis shoes probably, I'm guessing, like maybe $15, $20 more than they would have cost otherwise. So kind of things like that, or like how the fact that, my cell phone quality, voice quality stinks because I think in part there's not a whole lot of competition for that. So that sort of thing. So folks, if you have some examples of kind of not the great injustices of our times, but the annoyances of our times that you think are due to government action or inaction, I would love to hear about them, to maybe, consider putting them in the book. So if you could let me know, that would be great. And you can just, email me those at mike@politicsguys.com, and I would really appreciate it. And Jay, I'm sure you have a few things come to mind for you. Yeah, so I had a feeling. So, and this is not going to be, like a liberal or conservative. I'm looking for things on both sides because I think that these annoyances are very much bipartisan. So I'm looking forward to hearing what folks have to say. All right. So let's start, Jay, with the trial of former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, which, of course, began this week. It was an 18-count indictment against him, and it centers on tax fraud, and bank fraud conspiracy. And aside from that, apparently, Manafort is also a fairly vulgar, greedy, and odious person, but none of that is illegal, which I'd say is a good thing, especially in Washington, D.C.
Now, was there also, and again, I looked at the indictment a while back. Was there also a failing to register as a foreign agent?
I don't know that. I didn't.
Or if that was with him, that might have been one of the other ones.
Yeah, I didn't see that in the indictment, though it has been.
Doesn't need to be in there. There's plenty of other stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Of course, all of these charges, right, came out of Robert Mueller's Russia investigation, but nothing that Manafort's charged with is actually directly related to either Russian interference in the 2016 elections or any potential Trump-Russia collusion. I think it's important to point out here.
It is related though to his dealings with folks in the Ukraine and from Russian-backed
exactly. So there's like an indirect kind of thing, but it's not like a direct focusing. And generally speaking,
it's got nothing to do with the election.
Yeah.
or Trump at this point.
Right. And so now, according to what Manafort's attorneys are saying, bad things did happen, but they happened because Paul Manafort sort of naively trusted his business partner, Rick Gates, who's pled guilty to a number of charges and is agreed to testify against Manafort. Now, President Trump has called the prosecution a hoax, whatever that means. Now, my guess...
It's a real prosecution.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's happening. My guess, though, is that it means that, in his mind, anything connected with Mueller is de facto illegitimate. And of course, this week, the president tweeted that, for instance, Attorney General Jeff Sessions should shut down the entire Mueller investigation, or as he called it, the rigged witch hunt. Now, I also should point out, this isn't actually something that Sessions can do because, much to the president's dismay, he recused himself, turned over that authority to Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. So, Jay, first off, I guess, what's your take on the whole Manafort trial. How important would you say it is in the larger scheme of things here?
I would say it's very important to Paul Manafort.
Yeah.
In the larger scheme of things, not much. This is what he's accused of. All happened in many cases many years before Trump was a candidate or even thinking about running. The crimes alleged don't really have anything to do with politics or anything like that. It's kind of garden variety money laundering. Um, and Manafort is entitled to the constitutional presumption that he is innocent until he is proven guilty. But don't look good.
No. Well, we know money was laundered and taxes were evaded. No one seems to be denying that. It's just a question of culpability.
Mistakes were made.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Well, obviously, some people on the right are saying that this is, if not a hoax, is at least an abuse of prosecutorial discretion on the part of Mueller, arguing that, well, this doesn't have anything to do with the Russia investigation, so therefore he shouldn't be investigating. But I don't know, my sense of this is, okay, and I understand that point, but if you're investigating something and then you see that there were other crimes committed, it's not like you could say, well, we're just going to ignore these crimes. I mean, that would be wrong too. I mean, am I right here? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's the more interesting question. And at some point, I think early on, the judge expressed skepticism with the government of like, hey, is this really within your mandate of what you're supposed to be investigating, prosecuting? And there was then a motion to dismiss on that basis. And, the court basically came out the same way that said, look, this might not be what they're supposed to invest at the beginning, but look, if you find a crime here, and again, I think there's substantial evidence that, as you said, money was laundered, taxes were evaded. You can't, someone doesn't simply have immunity because that was discovered by a special prosecutor, as opposed to a garden variety, FBI or IRS investigation.
Right. And so I guess another thing kind of related to this that people say, well, this was, it's not that this was just found. It's like, oh, look, we happened to find a crime, but that was a specific focus of the Mueller team. And they were looking for something that they could use against Manafort, anything really to make him flip on the president, presuming that he actually has information. And now that is maybe a different story, but I guess that would be very difficult to prove because it gets into, what's the mindset and the sort of the prosecutors. And I think you kind of have to, you can't really know that, right?
Right. And my understanding of this was a lot of this was in many ways sort of in the can already before the special prosecutors even appointed, that Mueller or that Manafort had been looked at by the FBI. And if I'm incorrect on that, I mean, somebody correct me, but this seems to be sort of, they had a case against Manafort, long before he became a Trump campaign manager.
Right. And so that just would happen to be a happy coincidence, I guess, if you're
right.
You're the Mueller team.
Now again, it's certainly you can argue over abuse of power, and is it a politically motivated prosecution and so forth? And I expect the defense will make those arguments. Yeah. But at the end of the day, if he did it, he did. Now, I compare it to, if you look at the Ted Stevens prosecution. Ted Stevens, a former senator from Alaska. In that case, I would say it was a politically motivated prosecution, but the problem was it wasn't just politically motivated. It was badly handled, unconstitutionally handled. That the federal government failed to turn over evidence to the defense that it was required to turn over, and that there was actually intention not to do that in order to convict. So that's sort of a different problem, and it comes down to, in a lot of cases, the motivations, while it's certainly troubling and people should raise questions about them, that doesn't necessarily, in and of itself, affect the validity of the investigation.
Right. Yeah.
Or the prosecution. I mean, there might be other things to flow from that if you're so motivated, you will take other shortcuts that would render a trial, unconstitutional.
Right.
But
Right.
there's no evidence at this point.
Yeah.
So
Now, what about kind of the larger thing? President Trump's calls to end the entire investigation, and he's kind of ramped that up lately. And my view here is I think it's just essentially, well, disgraceful that a sitting president would, not only attempt to influence an ongoing investigation, but that he would really continually disparage, the independence and the integrity of prosecutors and the entire process. I mean, that to me is just beyond the pale.
well, for me, I don't know if it's beyond the pale. I think it's certainly not helpful for Trump. Just from a political standpoint, I think, look, if there is a legitimate argument to be made that Mueller is acting outside of his powers, that this is a political quest rather than one for justice, I think it's a fair game to call that out. Should the president do it? No. I think that's the bigger problem. Should the guy who just look, that's just a matter of common sense, and I'm not defending Trump or not defending Trump on this. I'm saying if someone wants to question the integrity of the Mueller investigation, it shouldn't be the target of the investigation.
Yeah, I mean, and
although, and again, taking back, supposedly he's not actually a target at this point, but
right, because and even if he was, there was no collusion.
But I think at this point, officially, the FBI has said that he is not a target at this point.
Even though that, I mean, Robert Mueller is seeking to interview the president, and that's, I guess, those negotiations are still supposedly in the last week or so. They have heated up a little bit more. There's some kind of movement, and there's been some chatter that maybe that would be the last stage, and the report would be issued soon, but nobody really knows. That's all very, very speculative. But I guess my larger point and my larger concern is that I think it's important that everyone believe that when the Justice Department is investigating anything in the executive branch, that they are independent. And I think that the president just simply does not appreciate that. It doesn't even really care about that, because I think it's fundamentally his focus and his worldview is, what is good or bad for Donald Trump. And if what's good for Donald Trump is bad for the country, well, then I'll do what's good for Donald Trump.
Look, fair enough, but again, I'll go back to my point. I think Trump very much believes, quite sincerely, that this is a made-up prosecution directed against him, and it's politically motivated. There would be evidence to support that conclusion, but the response isn't. At least the response from him ought not to be. This is a rigged witch hunt, as opposed to legitimate witch hunts. That's being put in for political purpose, but that there's nothing, no collusion. The factual defense of saying I didn't do anything, assuming he didn't. So well, I mean, I think it's important to. I mean, I'm all for deference to the Justice Department and its powers to investigate. But if you look at the history, it's not perfect, and part of our system is that we are allowed a defense and push back and ought to push back if we see something as politically motivated.
Sure, I think that the president, like anyone else, deserves a presumption of innocence. I don't quarrel with that at all.
Right.
Though I think also
that said, and let's put it this. Maybe this is the best way to put it. He deserves the presumption of innocence. The Justice Department deserves the presumption of integrity.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless proved otherwise.
Yeah, I think
that would be the best way to state it.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention before we move on is, you mentioned that, well, you believe that the president is sincere in his belief that this is a rigged witch hunt. And certainly that's one possibility, and I don't discount that. But I think another possibility is the president knows all good and well that he's got some serious Russia-related skeletons in the closet that he doesn't want out, and he knows that it's not a rigged witch hunt and that things could be uncovered that could damage or destroy his presidency, and he doesn't want that to happen. And that's another, I think, very reasonable, viable explanation for what's going on. And it's the one that I tend to think, there's certainly something potentially there.
The two aren't mutually exclusive, though.
You mean he could be guilty but believe he's innocent?
Yes.
I guess. Sure, yeah.
No, I mean, I know exactly. He could know the facts but still at the same time sincerely believe this is all just
I see what you're
because
saying.
of politics.
Right.
Yeah,
I see what you're saying, that he is guilty, but they're out to get him. But he
yeah,
happens to be
yeah.
guilty, which
And
makes
both
it
can be,
easier.
yes.
Sure.
Just because you're
Fair enough.
paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to our next story. Some people are calling this a significant development in gun control policy. Other people see it as a pretty serious attack on the First Amendment. A federal judge this week blocked the online release of instructions for making untraceable firearms in a 3D printer. 8 state attorneys general have argued that the blueprints pose a national security threat, and it seems like the judge believes they might have a point. Now, making your own weapons isn't illegal, but under the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, it is illegal to manufacture, import, sell, ship, deliver, possess, transfer, or receive a firearm that can't be detected by a metal detector or an X-ray machine. And that, of course, would mean potentially plastic 3D printed guns, though not all 3D printed guns are made of plastic, if you follow. Now, the problem here is that before the injunction was issued, around 1,000 or so people downloaded these 3D printer gun blueprints, and it's apparently not all that hard to find them in a web search. Now, this is not really a new issue entirely. This came up back in 2013. The Obama administration dealt with it by arguing that 3D printer gun blueprints, if they were put online, they'd then be available for international download and use, making them, in their view, a violation of the international traffic in arms regulations. Now, Defense Distributed, that's the Texas nonprofit that wanted to post these plans, they challenged this.
Texas.
Yeah, well, of course, I
love that.
It had to be Texas, right? And it's been in the courts since then. And what the Trump administration did to change things is they recently entered into a settlement agreement with Defense Distributed that would allow them to post the plans. And then that brings us essentially to the recent injunction. Now, the judge, Robert Glasnick, who's a Clinton appointee, he's scheduled a hearing on August 10th, my birthday, to determine whether or not his temporary injunction should be made permanent. So that kind of brings us up to where we're at. So, Jay, what are your thoughts on this?
I think first of all, I think what you gave was a really accurate summary of what the issue is all about and what's going on. Yeah, and I would say it's much better than how this was kind of portrayed in the mainstream media or just social media posts that Trump wants everyone to download a gun. Right. No, this is a situation of there are plans for these type of guns that have been available on the internet for years. Many of them still are. It was this specific plan that the Obama administration stepped in and said, no, because of the potential of foreign download, we're not going to let you do this. That proceeded through the courts, and it wasn't looking good. Trump, the Trump, again, this would be the Justice Department, made the decision that, look, this is a case we should settle rather than pursue. And I think that was probably the right call. So that said, I mean, to me, I don't see this as being a big deal one way or the other. I guess the more troubling aspect of this to me is, again, states attorneys general running into federal court to get nationwide injunctions that sort of strike at the heart of the way the federal judiciary is supposed to work. But that's a problem for the Supreme Court and to take up later. And my sense is that they probably will take it up at some point. But yeah, on the merits, I can't get my printer to work on a good day to print out like 2 pieces of paper.
I think that's an interesting point, because they're actually, when you think, well, how easy is it to print undetectable 3D gun? Well, to give you an example, you can, if you have the right tools, print a 3D plastic gun. In fact, Australian police, they bought a 3D printer for, I think it was around $1,700, and they printed the gun called the Liberator, which is one of the guns blueprints that Defense Distributed put out there. They did this in 2013. They fired one round and the gun shattered.
Yeah.
So that plastic guns have a
because
tendency
plastic, as you might expect, plastic guns aren't that great.
Now you can make a 3D printed gun out of metal, and that probably wouldn't be, there's a reason why guns are made out of metal, but those machines are a lot more expensive. We're talking $100,000 plus, from what I understand. So it's not like this is the kind of thing where you can just go out to Staples and get yourself.
Or you could buy one at Exporting Goods for much. Yeah. So yeah,
exactly.
it's.
But that said, especially given the availability of cheap, almost untraceable handguns in the United States, this is more like the kind of thing that like a hitman or someone would use, not like a general crime sort of thing, which does not make it okay, certainly. And of course, I think we should point out that as the technology improves, this is likely to be more and more of a serious issue. So I'm not poo-pooing this or anything, but at this point, it is not this grave threat right now. And to me, I guess the fundamental issue is I don't see this as a Second Amendment issue so much as I do a First Amendment issue. And I'm really troubled by...
And you'd be correct on that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm really troubled by the prior restraint. This idea that you can, essentially, and that's what the judge's injunction does. It's a case of prior restraint. And we have a long history in this country of not engaging in prior restraint, saying things can't be published, preventing them from being published, whereas the other case is, well, once it's published, then you can talk about it and bring it into the courts. But so this to me strikes at the heart of the First Amendment, and I have a big problem with this, with what the judge did. Even though I am a strong advocate for stricter gun control laws, this to me, I have big problems with this.
Right. No, wow, you're on fire on this one.
I also think I should say that, certainly, we have the Undetectable Firearms Act, obviously.
It's even if they do it, it's illegal anyway.
Yeah, but I think the idea that you can somehow put this cat back into the bag. This is out there. This information is not going to be. People who want to find this information now can. And so the idea that we can, even in any real sense, do anything about it is just wrong, for one thing. And so especially given that, the idea that we're going to trample on the First Amendment to try to do something that we can't do anyway, I just think that's just incredibly just wrong-headed. Though I will say that I can sort of see the judge maybe saying, okay, let's wait just for this short period of time, and I'll make this ruling when we have more evidence presented. So, and this is not a long period of time. So I guess I would be much more concerned if after that hearing on August 10th, the judge doesn't lift this, basically. Then I think that would be a big issue for me. And again, it's not because I'm not very concerned about the availability of untraceable guns. It's because I'm concerned about the First Amendment here.
Sure. And in the way, I think you're right on the prior restraint, that I think the judge still probably got it wrong, issuing the temporary restraining order. But procedurally, the way these things work is temporary restraining orders are issued sometimes ex parte, sometimes on a very limited hearing, and then they're followed up by a hearing that is more to the merits, and that's what we're going to see. So it's not terribly unusual for a court just to say, okay, hold on, we're going to put on the brakes here so we can get this all sorted out. And again, that's typically done in fairly short order. So my sense is if you're the manufacturer, they're like, all right, we got to wait a couple weeks to have this on the merits. It's not going to be a tremendous big deal. So,
and so we will. I'm sure we will revisit that after the 10th, and the judge issues his ruling, and that will. I would expect. I would hope that he would side with the First Amendment on this. But we shall see, and we will report back on it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, before we get to our next story, I want to thank our newest supporters. First is Benji. He's our newest monthly sustaining supporter, and he writes, this is a great message. Mike, Jay, and Trey, my apologies as it's taken me so long to become a Patreon supporter. I am a recent college graduate that is yet to receive my first big boy paycheck.
Hang in there, Benji.
Yeah, absolutely. He says,
we've all been there.
Yeah, it's been a while for us, but yes, I can vaguely remember. He writes, I've been a loyal listener for more than 2 years. The service your podcast provides for this country is invaluable. Mike, you always manage to bring a smile to my face, even when I disagree with your opinion, which is such a rare treat in the polarized political landscape we live in. Jay, please take fewer vacations and figure out your communication snafus. The show is not the same when Mike hosts on his own. Collaboration between your unique perspectives elucidates insight neither of you articulates well going solo.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. I'll just say yes. The law is a harsh mistress.
Yeah,
It's sort of my excuse for that. But yes, thanks.
And then
it's good to know I missed one away.
You are definitely missed, Jay. I have a message for Trey. It says, Trey, I like you, but you are still a young Jedi. I am also a Padawan, but so don't feel too bad. The diversity of your topics and hyper-awareness of your audience frightens me at times, but nonetheless, I am grateful for you all allowing me to engage and giving great feedback. There's an old Chinese curse that feels apt. May you live in interesting times. Well, if these aren't interesting times, I am not sure what is. I plan to increase my donations as my paychecks start to accrue, so please continue the exceptional dialogue. Politics Guys is a beacon of hope for the future.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
thank you.
wasn't that an awesome message?
Really
yeah, I thought that was really great. So thanks, Benji. Our next new supporter is Brian, who I believe actually lives more or less kind of in my neck of the woods here in the greater Cincinnati area. Brian made a generous contribution to the show through PayPal. So thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
And finally, we have another new PayPal supporter this week, and that is Morgan. So Morgan, thank you very much. And of course, when you become a supporter of the show, you not only help keep us going, making us that beacon of hope for the future, as Benji says. I like that. We should be a motto there. Anyway, but you also get access to our special supporters only after show. Last week, Trey and Ken talked about Democratic Socialists, the changing Democratic Party, and stand your ground gun laws. And this week, Jay and I, we have some pretty good stuff lined up for you as well. So to do that, just go to, politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link, or just politicsguys.com, and you'll see the Patreon, PayPal support kind of things on there. So we appreciate it. Thank you very much, folks. All right, moving on. This week, the Trump administration announced a plan to freeze automotive fuel efficiency standards for 6 years, as well as to challenge California's longstanding waiver, which allows it to set its own more stringent standards. Now, the administration claims that the change will not only save an estimated $2,300 on each new vehicle, which, if you believe that, there's this bridge I'd love to sell you. But anyway, but that it will also result in thousands of fewer highway fatalities. Now, the cost-saving argument is, I'd say, the most obvious one. You know, if companies have to invest in making more efficient vehicles, they're likely to pass that cost on to consumers. Not $2,300 per car, but it's not nothing either.
Well, I think it's, we talked about this before. Because of the way that the CAFE standards work, what ends up happening is buyers of some cars end up subsidizing buyers of others.
Right. Yeah. And it would have to hapen that way, given.
So it's sort of when you say 2,300 across the board, you have some people who would be saving a lot more.
Yeah.
And some people who would not see those savings probably at all.
That's a good point, because it's across the entire fleet of cars that the vehicle makes. Yeah. Good point. But to me, it's the saving lives argument that's a lot more, I guess I'll call it tenuous. It's based on the assumption that people will drive will drive many more miles in more fuel efficient vehicles, which will of course result in more accidents. And to me, number one, that's not really supported by the evidence. It also isn't really supported by, I won't call it common sense, but if you think about how most people drive, it doesn't really, it's like, oh, my car gets 10 more miles to the gallon, I'm going to drive much further. I mean, so I think they
10 more miles worth of lives of hundreds of people.
I think they just threw that in there to make it sound better, but it doesn't really track anyway. And of course, it also doesn't take into account the health impact of less fuel efficient vehicles. There's one estimate, I'm sure it's a high end estimate, but it puts the consequence of the proposed freeze as kind of equivalent to putting 30 additional coal-fired power plants into operation. Now, you might think that the automotive industry would be all for this, but you'd actually, surprisingly, maybe you'd be wrong about that. mean, what the auto industry is mainly interested in is having a clear national standard. And they've actually come out in support of fuel efficiency standards. But now the oil and gas companies, that's a different story. They're actually pretty happy about this move because obviously less fuel efficient means more purchases of their products. Now, this proposal isn't going to go into effect right away. It's up for public comment for, I believe, 60 days, though it's a safe bet that no matter what happens, California and the 12 states plus the District of Columbia that follow California's fuel efficiency standard will sue. Now, California is going to argue that its waiver can't be removed by administrative regulation. And what they're going to cite is a specific exemption for California that was written into the Clean Air Act of 1970. And that exemption allows California to set its own standards so long as they're at least as strict as federal standards and are necessary, in the words of the exemption, to meet compelling and extraordinary conditions in California. So that no matter what, I'm sure there's going to be a legal battle over this. Jay, what do you make of all this? How do you see it playing out?
Well, first, on the California question, I think you're right, and I think California is right on the legal merits of the thing, wrong on the policy.
Right.
But yeah, if they've got a statutory exemption, I don't think that can be. I don't want to say I don't think. I would say it can't.
And let me just
be undone by just a regulatory action.
Before I go any further, I just want to stop right here to make a point. Now, I know this is kind of a larger point, but there are so many listeners who say about you, Jay, that you never depart from sort of your policy preferences, orthodoxy. And when you said that, it just occurred to me.
Which is strange.
Well, this is a great example of, now, obviously, this is not really a conservative policy preference to have California set these sort of things, but you just said they're right on the legal merits. So this is the case where I would think that your policy preference diverges from what you see as the legal merits. And I just wanted to point that out to say that I'm not the only one who's occasionally sort of a little heterodox on sort of that. But, Jay, good for you, Jay.
Well, I would say, and it's less about being heterodox. It's more just about,
following the law,
being a constitutionalist.
Fair enough. Yeah.
You and I talk all the time about stuff that is dumb or stuff we don't like, but it's constitutional.
Yeah.
Here is something I think California having its own admissions standards is dumb, but it's constitutional the way it's written right now. I haven't done a deep dive into this, but it's been constitutional for 40 some years. So, let's assume that it would remain so. To me, and I think to a lot of conservatives, oftentimes the structural issues are more important, or I think they ought to be more important than the who wins. Sort of the integrity of the game is more important than if your team happens to win that particular game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think certainly your argument, I assume, would be that if you believe that this exemption, this waiver for California is bad policy, then the proper thing to do would be for Congress to pass an amendment to the Clean Air Act, taking that away, basically.
Absolutely. Yes.
I think that's
it's a question of where the decision should be made. Now, as far as on the merits of the rest of it, I'm generally in favor of this sort of deregulation. In that, let's allow companies to sell the products that they want to sell and customers want to buy. You're exactly right on the auto industry. And this is sort of a funny thing that I think so many folks don't realize. Businesses, industries can adapt to most any regulation because they can always sort of pass the cost on to the consumer. And if the regulation is more or less uniform, they're okay. And in fact, they like those regulations because what it does is it raises the cost of entry to someone else. So it makes perfect sense that the automakers don't have any real fight in this. I would point out that again, there's sort of the wonderful irony we talked before that it's sort of the electric. Your Prius is being subsidized by people who are buying big pickup trucks. And one can argue the fairness or unfairness of that. But no, I think generally it's a good policy. And then my last point, and this is also maybe I'll take issue with the Trump administration, at least the rollout of it. This is something that is, I don't know if it's ideological, maybe it's just sort of my own weird pet peeve. But when we devolve into the this will cost lives, this will save lives kind of argument, to me that is almost always ridiculous and silly.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, look, there are some regulations and things that will affect people's lives. Um, Changing mileage standards, I don't see as being one of them. Um, Likewise, on the same token, I would say changing the emission standards, I don't see it, causing a vast swath of death if average fleet mileage decreases. So I think that's one of those things. It's bad for our politics of the hey, I'd like to tweak this regulation, and the response is people will die. Or by the same token, in this case, people will die if we don't tweak this regulation.
Right.
It sort of artificially heightens the stakes, and just makes it more difficult for anyone to find common ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one final point I'd like to make is the reason why I am for certain types of regulations like this, I think it's a great example, is because of what I think I understand about human nature and what I think, behavioral economics and psychology tell us, and that's that people, for the most part, are not a very good judge of long-term consequences of small individual actions. So the fact that my individual vehicle is a little less fuel efficient, no, that doesn't matter a whole lot, but the cumulative effect of that over 10, 20 years is, I would argue, very significant. And because we can't really expect people to take that into account, that's when government steps in and says, well, to serve the greater good over the long term, we're going to impose this because we understand that people are not going to be able to make this decision in the land. Is that more paternalistic? Yeah, absolutely it is. And I think in certain cases that's a good thing. And that's kind of where I part course with, the libertarians on some things.
Yeah.
So, all right. More regulatory type stuff. I love it. We can talk about policy stuff. The Affordable Care Act suffered yet another blow this week. The Trump administration announced new insurance rules expanding so-called short-term health insurance policies. Now, these policies were intended to provide sort of low-cost, minimalist coverage for a limited amount of time, sort of like, for instance, when people were between jobs.
Between jobs.
Yeah. And they're not subject to ACA minimal coverage provisions. They were limited to 3 months in duration by the Obama administration, but under the new rules that the Trump administration is proposing, they can last up to a year with the possibility of a 2-year renewal. So effectively, a 3-year thing. Now, folks that are in favor of this change say, my understanding is that it's part of the administration's effort basically to give consumers more and better choices. Detractors, and that would include me, argue that these plans are not only going to provide less coverage than many people realize, something that's going to end up hurting a lot of people when they need medical treatment most, but secondly, it's also going to siphon the healthiest people out of Obamacare markets, which is going to drive up costs for everyone else. Because, of course, we've talked about this before, the only way that any health insurance market, really any insurance market, can work is if the healthier subsidize the less healthy. And this is going to make that less likely. And I want to point out the larger context here. Republicans have already done what they could to hobble Obamacare markets. After they failed to repeal the legislation, thanks to that very dramatic last-minute thumbs down by Senator John McCain. You go, John McCain. They've removed the tax penalty for people who don't have health insurance. They've slashed the advertising budget for ACA signups, and they've ended the cost-sharing reduction payments to insurers, and that partially compensated insurers for providing required mandatory out-of-pocket spending discounts for lower-income Obamacare enrollees. So, there's been sort of basically once the Republicans couldn't find a way to just legislatively kill Obamacare outright, they said, well, what can we do to essentially collapse these markets? And this is just another way that they've basically done that, essentially.
Well, I'm going to go back to the structural thing we just talked about a minute ago. so much of Obamacare was done by regulation rather than by statute, and the administrative pen giveth and it taketh away. I think that's sort of that's the lesson. And again, as more of a structuralist, look, I think it would have been had this stuff been written into the legislation as opposed to just done by rule. The folks who are in favor of the prior Obamacare 3-month rule wouldn't be where they are. That said, on the merits, I as you might expect, I think this is fantastic. It gives consumers an option that they didn't have before, and that allowing more options, that's what makes this work. My sense is I don't think you'd see a mass exodus from the Obamacare exchange plans, because to the extent of the folks who are being subsidized on those plans. So if you're getting a subsidy on an exchange plan, it is still most likely going to be cheaper for you to stick with that than to go with this intermediate. And that's sort of the point is not one size fits all, and this is a size that would fit other people. And I think it's really great. I'm thinking back to again the just first couple years out of college, Mike, when what you need typically is not a comprehensive healthcare plan covering every possible contingency, but it's a catastrophic plan that is affordable as people kind of move in and when they get their first real job, as Benji said, first big boy paycheck. Hopefully, that's one that would come with healthcare benefits. So I think it's great. I mean, more consumer choice, and if people find this to be a better choice than the exchange plans, then they'll take it. If they won't.
Well, I think that choice can be a good thing, but I think this valorization of choice is sort of this wonderful thing in all instances, and more choice is always better. I disagree with that, and again, that's where I part ways. This is yet another reason why I am not a libertarian, though I am sympathetic to them on certain issues. This idea that I guess there's kind of a fundamental assumption that many conservatives and particular libertarians make of kind of hyper rationality. I think that healthcare is an issue, an area that is just simply way too complex for tens of millions of Americans to understand and to evaluate. And I just talked before in the climate change issue about how we know for a fact people are notoriously bad about estimating long-term concerns and issues, whether it's what's going to happen with the climate or themselves, especially younger people who tend to think that they're bulletproof and that sort of thing. And this is why I think this is a place, and paternalistic has gotten a bad name, but this is why some policies should be more paternalistic in my view. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from on this, certainly. And what I think is, in a way, and I've heard this argument from some of my friends who are a little bit further left than I am, and I have some sympathy for it, is maybe in a way this is a good thing, because what this is going to do is eventually push us to a point where the only viable option is kind of a Medicare for all type of plan. And that's something that actually we had a listener recently ask us about, and we're going to be talking about it a little bit on our Wednesday show. And I actually think that would be a great thing for people in, say, Benji's situation or other situations, that ideally you don't have to worry about it, that everyone gets guaranteed minimum benefits so they don't have to worry about that thing. That would be my ideal. Certainly that's how almost all other rich, developed countries are doing it, except for us, because we're American exceptionalism there, in this case for the worse. But that's a much larger policy issue, obviously. I think, Jay, you would agree with that.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And again, I think it's sort of the, if the alternative is, well, we could do this, or Medicare for all. I think that's sort of a false choice.
Yeah, certainly.
In the meantime, let's see how these temporary plans work. Well, let me put it this way, though, Mike. Don't you think, again, as a policy matter, setting the renewability for these types of plans, which aren't new, they've been around for forever. What was new was under Obamacare, they are limited to 3 months.
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't 3 months strike you as an artificially short timeline?
Yeah, no, I forgot to comment on that point because I thought it was a great
Yeah.
point that you made. Now, to
And now
be,
we're talking about to a year.
yeah, well, what actually happened is the limit when the ACA was passed, the limit for these short-term plans, there was no set limit. And then what the Obama administration realized is that people were using them as long-term workarounds. So they'd get a 3-month plan, then they'd renew it again and again and again. So it was, in effect, the same thing. So what they did is then they put that 3-month thing on it after the fact.
Right.
And to me, this gets to your point, is in a reasonably well-functioning system, here's what happens. You pass a big piece of legislation, and because it's big and complex, there's no way in the world you can possibly anticipate all the various workarounds and loopholes in that. And so what you do then after the fact is you go back legislatively and you pass a series
Administrative.
well, no, legislatively.
Legislatively to empower the administrative.
Exactly. You pass a series of fixes. You say, well, okay, people are using this as a loophole. Now, the quick and easy way to do it is through the regulatory process. But as you pointed out, the pen can giveth and the pen taketh away. So if you're concerned about long-term stability, what you do is you use the political process and you pass legislative amendments, which are much firmer and longer lasting. But the problem is given the fact that our legislative majorities are so short term, and we have to just basically push these huge things through whenever we can get a brief veto filibuster proof majority, we are not in a position where we can do that like we've done it for decades past. And so that leads to bad law. And that's why we're in part in the situation we're in. And that's yet another example of how polarization is really making us worse in terms of, the kind of stable, solid legislation that I think we need.
I just add, though, keep in mind, this was passed party line by Democrats.
Yep.
So presumably, if they had had enough Democrat support for shortening the length of terms for short-term plans,
I see what you're saying.
They could have done so,
but they didn't. They didn't.
Now whether it was by oversight that they couldn't see this problem coming, my sense is, look, these Obama and Gruber and all these people are very smart, and just ask them, they'll tell you. So I think this certainly could have been foreseen, but my sense was they might have lost the Democrat votes that they needed to pass it if they had included something like this.
No, I think you're totally wrong on that. I think you're giving you're giving them too much credit. I think in any piece of legislation that's this big, there are just literally dozens, if not hundreds of things that nobody sees. I can't think of a single major piece of legislation that passed that the people who were the biggest proponents didn't come back and if they were honestly in private saying, "Oh yeah, we didn't think of that." I mean,
and with that, you've just made my argument against government paternalism.
Okay, you lost me there.
Well, no, I mean, if the idea is that the market, if consumers can't be trusted to make up the quote right choices, so government has to step in and sort of do it for them or help them.
No, I see what you're saying. I know.
And the government isn't really competent to do it either.
Yeah, I disagree. I think it's a false choice. I think it's not a question of either consumers are competent or incompetent or government's competent or incompetent. It's a question of you have to take a look at the particular situation, the issue, the psychology behind it, if you will, the expertise, the complexity. So I would be uncomfortable making a blanket statement about that. And I would say just in general that the legislative process, if it's to work properly, needs to be an iterative process, meaning that we can't just assume that we're going to know everything and pass a law and it's going to be great. We need to go back and say what's worked, what hasn't, and then keep the things that work and change the things that don't. But we don't have a political system now that allows us to do that. And that, I think, is a huge problem. And I don't know that you disagree with that entirely.
No, I don't disagree with again, it's one of the, well, I shouldn't say diagnosis. No, you're right on the system. I think with a little more work, I guess my problem is I read the government's action on this differently. I read it as they couldn't get it through legislatively because they didn't have the votes. So what they did was they took the shortcut, allowing legislators who are supposed to be
right.
Accountable to avoid the hard choice, and then well, don't worry, we'll just do it through regulation later.
Yeah,
and that's troubling to the system, and I think you agree with me on that that's a bad way to govern.
Yeah,
regardless of the reason of why it's done that way, it's a bad way to govern.
Absolutely, I agree that is a bad way to govern, and that happens all the time. I just disagree that it happened in this particular instance.
Right.
All right.
Sure.
All right, well, that does it for this week's show. But before we go, I want to let everyone know that as soon as Jay and I are done recording this show, we're going to be doing our special supporters after show exclusive thing. I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about the whole TSA Quiet Skies program. Pretty interesting, I think, and also maybe a little bit about the battle between Donald Trump and the Koch brothers for the future of the Republican Party. That kind of heated up a little bit this week, and maybe some other things. We'll kind of see how that goes. But if you are a supporter, of course, all that will be waiting for you by the time you hear this. And if you're not a supporter and you'd like to check it out, just go to politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link, or you can just go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links, or support the show on the main menu there. Also, just remember, if you have an example of ways in which government action or inaction just makes your life worse, I'd love to know about that for possible inclusion in my book. And again, you can email me, mike@politicsguys.com.
Can't your truck cost more because of cafe standards?
There you go. Okay. So everyone, thanks so much for listening. Listener support, of course, is what keeps the show going. We do appreciate it. And we also appreciate if you subscribe to the show if you haven't already, as well as sharing episodes or leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes. And of course, if you want to get in touch, you know how, mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us and we post stuff throughout the week. Facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope to join us.